So Jonathan Blow is, I think it's not an exaggeration to say he's one of the most important game designers working today. He's a programmer and a game developer who's been working in the industry for many, many years. He had a game programming column in Game Developer Magazine. A few years ago, he started work on a game called Braid, which came out in 2008. Is that right? It came out last year. It came out on Xbox as a downloadable game on Xbox Live Arcade, and it is going to be coming out as a PC game very shortly. Braid is a remarkable game that got a huge amount of attention. It is extremely critically acclaimed and also extremely successful. And it's kind of proof that a single person with a lot of dedication and talent can make a game that makes a big splash. Asks some really interesting questions about the capability of games to be meaningful and expressive in new ways. It engendered a ton of super interesting debate and discussion in the field of games and in a large number of venues, in mainstream media and in gaming media. And it's also a tremendously interesting and beautiful game. So I, without any further ado, I give you Jonathan Blow.
Hopefully the mic's live. Is this?
What's that?
Is this working?
Yes, the mic's working.
Yeah, awesome.
Okay.
All right, so Frank asked me to lay down some context, and by way of doing that, I figured I would just sort of talk about what I've been doing in games for the past my whole life, and how I got to where I am today. I was born in California in 1971. Southern-ish California, and as far as I can remember, I always loved video games. Even when I was 5 or 6 years old, I would just love to run down to arcades and play whatever lousy video games we had at the time, which was like a coin-op asteroids machine or something like that. I just loved it. Sometime around the 5th grade, I started actually programming computers. We had a classroom with Commodore VIC-20s in it, which had, as you can see, a whole 4K of RAM, which was awesome. And very quickly, because of my enthusiasm for these, I became by far the best programmer in my little 5th grade class, which isn't really saying much. But then over the course of grade school and through high school, I kept up this kind of hobbyist programming at home. I liked it a lot. I kept kind of pushing the envelope of how difficult the things were that I was trying to do. I started out programming in BASIC on one computer, then another one, then like in machine language, because that's what you had to do to make things run fast. But I never there's some kind of escape velocity that you can get from doing pretend things into doing real things. I was still kind of doing pretend things. And I think that's because there wasn't that much communication or connection. Like we're talking the 1980s here. We didn't really have the internet. You kind of had BBSs where you might vaguely know people. And if I wanted to figure out how to do something like on the Commodore 64, which was the massive version of this with a whole 64K of RAM, actually 40K that you could actually use, there was no way to find out. You just had to either experiment or maybe hear about some vague book that could tell you how to do something that certainly wasn't going to be available in a local bookstore. All that changed when I went to college, University of California at Berkeley. And that gave me 2 things that were very, very valuable, right? One was the context to understand what kind of thought is really behind computers. Like people who do real computer things, like computer science, what is that? And that actually took a lot of personal sifting, because a lot of what's called computer science is just kind of BS, but some of it is real, right? And finding the real part and understanding that was very, very valuable to me. And the other part, which is maybe even more valuable, was just having all these people around me who were interested, the kind of environment you're in now. Undoubtedly, you have peers doing interesting things here and there. And that's where I really kind of took off and started doing creative things that were more real or maybe more impactful. And I spent so much time working on my own projects that I left college without a degree. After a year or two of doing random jobs, I started a company with another friend who I met in college. Wow. I guess we can't really do anything about this to make it more readable, but that's fine. Yeah, we started as a two-person company, and this was before the idea of indie games was really like a thing, right? So it was just, we're going to start this game company. We don't really know that much about the game business, but we know that we're really good at programming, and we can totally beat what the big teams do, right? Back then, a big team was like 12 to 20 people, and a big game budget was like $1 million, right? So this is the first actual game that I ever worked on and shipped. It's a 3D multiplayer, action strategy, science fiction war game with like hover tanks and stuff, like 32 to 64 players. This was very hard to program. This was back in the day when you had to draw every pixel on the screen yourself, but people were starting to care about quality, so it was like perspective correct texture mapping and all that. And you had to send all this data over modems, for 64 players. It was really a lot of effort to figure out and make it work well. Eventually, after about 4 years, this company, we finally gave up on it. We were too poor for too long and worked too hard and didn't get very much out of it. At least it felt that way. So we shut down the company with like $100,000 in debt, back when $100,000 was real money. Actually, I got a tremendous amount out of it, because this was when I really took all that idea kind of stuff in school and like honed it and figured out what really worked and threw away all the ideas that were just a little too academic. Academic ideas are always good, but sometimes they're not grounded and sometimes they are, right? And figuring out which ones were really grounded and meaningful. And most of the actual programming skill that I have today, I developed over about this 4 years, kind of trial by fire thing. After that, I just finished trying to do a big game. A bunch of people played it and liked it, but it didn't hit or anything. I was poor. So I started doing consulting for various bigger game companies, either working from home for a while or, oh my God, we need to ship in time for Xbox launch. Will you come to our company, and live with us and like work on it for 3 months? So I did a bunch of things like that, saw what a bunch of people were doing. As Frank said, I was the technical columnist for Game Developer Magazine for a couple of years. And I was trying to, not just talk about here's how you achieve technical things in games and do a good job, but I was actively trying to push the edge of what people were doing, well, here's the things that, I would start a column like, here's the things that we know are how you solve this problem, but what if we expand our idea of the problem? Or what if we push a little harder into things that might be impractical, but might also yield some reward if we take a risk and maybe fail, right? I did that for a couple of years. These diagrams are some interesting diagrams from that column. So the top two are about IK with quaternions, and the bottom one is about playing with mass distributions. I spoke a lot at the Game Developers Conference over this period. I did, co-hosted a conference called the Game Tech Conference, which was a very small, maybe 40 or 50 attendees over 4 days who were like the tech leads from all the big game companies, most of which are still in business. And I also co-rented some office space called the Indie Game Barn with some friends. This is when the idea of indie games actually finally did happen. And I worked on a bunch of small projects. But as you can see from what I've been summarizing, I was very, very tech-oriented. Like, not only in that earlier part of my life, but even the column and the conferences, I was very much a programmer, right? And very much thinking about things from a technical perspective. And I never actually shipped a game over this period, even though I told myself I was working on games that I was going to ship. And the main reason was that I was very excited by technical problems, and I would pick problems that were in reality too hard to solve in a practical working game, given the time and effort that I, as a lone human, had to funnel into those things. A little bit after that, I moved around. I went to Austin to do some consulting, and I worked on this game, which I really rather liked. It's not really technically oriented. I used my engine from previous games and had all that, and I was like, I'm going to focus on gameplay. But I still had a very tech kind of idea about game design, which was that a good game design is where you make a game design that nobody's ever seen before, almost like a work of science fiction or something. Like the player does some activities that they've never been exposed to, and it's very experimental, right? So this game was about drawing shapes on the screen to cast spells, like you might have seen in some games like Black and White or something. But the gameplay of this was about using the nuances of the shape you draw to control parameters of what you were doing, right? So here I'm casting a magic missile to throw it at somebody, and I can control the damage, right? How far it'll go, how long I can hold it before I have to throw it, how it'll track targets, and how fast it'll go, all by nuances in how I draw the shape. And it was completely unplayable. Like, I, as a designer, could not even play it, right? Because I just can't hold 5 parameters in my head. I couldn't even play this with 2 parameters, right? So yeah, that game didn't go that far. But also during this period, I think one of the best things that I did in terms of my own personal growth was this thing called the Experimental Gameplay Workshop, which I started. The first one happened in 2002, every year at the Game Developers Conference. And it was a 2 or 3 hour session where I would just bring together, I would take submissions from a bunch of people who were working on these kind of experimental games, doing things that nobody had done before. And I and some friends would kind of curate them and pick out the ones that we thought served the mission of the workshop the best. And then they would come and present it. And audiences always loved seeing these games that were really wacky and strange. And it not only gave them concrete ideas, but it was just inspiring to see that there were people out there working on stuff that was outside of the mainstream, still at a time when the mainstream was really very dominant and there wasn't necessarily a belief that anything else could exist. You know, now it's like, oh yeah, indie games are a thing. Like, you can download games on XBLA and PSN and like play them, right? That did not exist back at this time. This was like, you know, either you're making Quake 5 or you're nobody. So that was really cool for a lot of people, and it was also very helpful for me because I saw a great many things that people were doing, and it kind of all seeped into my head by osmosis. And I think that I matured a lot as a designer, and in terms of my aesthetic of what's interesting and what's not interesting. So sometime around late 2004, 2005, wow, you really can't see this, but you know, I decided it was time to make another game and ship it. And I absolutely wanted to ship something this time because all those little exercises that I did were interesting and valuable to do. But you know, I really wanted to make something that people would play again as opposed to being this inside the industry kind of person. So I decided to make a 2D platformer because, hey, it was going to be easy to make, right? I could program the hell out of that. And it's easy to play, right? Like 4 directions and a jump button, right? What is simpler? You know, I started making this game called Braid, and here's sort of how it looked the first time I showed it at the Experimental Gameplay Workshop in 2005. And you guys who have played it may recognize this level is actually in the final game. You know, many of them are. But it looks a lot better now, right? That took 3 years to make, and that sort of brings us to the present day, right? This was released in August. But that's also an important, I love to show this slide because it all started like here. This was the actual game. Like, I was able to show this to a big audience, and they got it, and they understood why it was cool, and people who played it understood why it was cool. You know, you didn't need all the money and all the time to do this part, even though that is the jump between being able to make a game that people will buy and not. And it's not just that they'll buy, but communicating your ideas to how broad of an audience. That's a whole other talk that I've never given. But anyway, so you know, that's sort of the step-by-step waypoints of how I got into games, what I did, and how I got to today. But you know, as I recounted those, I realized that those don't feel like me, actually, right? Those could kind of be anybody's story, like, oh, I liked games, and oh, I did this and did that. And so I started asking this question, like, what made this me, right? Why were these my choices? Why, you know, why way back here, I don't know, like here, didn't I just go and join a mainstream game company? Or why didn't I, you know, go work on movies or something, right? Everybody makes different choices. And why did I make the particular choices that I made? And I don't know the answer, right? It's something about, you know, as we live life and as we respond, we each have our own kind of way that we react to things intellectually. We each have our own way that we react to things emotionally. And something about that internal condition, right, that evolves from day to day brought me to where I am. And I can't really describe that, but I can give some flavor, right, about like why did I do these things? And the first bit of flavor is that even from an early age, you know, even as a little kid, like maybe even before I ever started typing on a VIC-20, I was very concerned with the meaning of life, right? And it's weird to think about a kid caring about that, but that was me. Like, I wanted to know what life was about. I had to know what I should be doing so that I could do the right thing, because if I was doing the wrong thing, that would be really bad. And really simplistic concepts like that, but they were very, very important, right? And that made life very hard from day to day. It was like, it was hard to talk to people because they would all be, you know, doing things that they cared very much about. And I'm like, why do you care about that? It's obviously the same as this, and that's not important, you know? And I didn't understand this back then, but as I look back at it now, maybe my love of video games comes from the fact that they give you a temporary meaning of life, you know, within a simplified version of our world, right? When you're in a game, you know why you're there, and you know what you're trying to do, and you know how to get better at it, right? And as somebody who always wanted to be better at everything, at being myself, that was very appealing to me, right? Or maybe, I don't know what order this happened in, right? Maybe because I cared so much about meaning, and then I saw games as this way of embodying it, or as creating a simplified world where it was easier to find meaning, right? Maybe that's why I loved them from an early age. I don't know. I'm not a good enough pop psychoanalyst. And then the second thing, major piece of flavor, which is related but not the same thing as the first one, is that I've never been much of an escapist, right? We have this cultural idea, and I'm going to jump to the movies for an analogy here, right? There's this idea that movies are something you go to escape most of the time, right? You want to have fun, or you want to get away from, you know, your job or your spouse who you don't like anymore, or whatever, right? There are all these reasons that you might engage in escapism, but like movies have never been escapism to me. You know, I watch them to go towards something, right? I don't watch them to go away from something else. And games are the same way, playing them, and not only playing them, but making them, right? I make games to go toward something that is important to me, but that is vague enough that I can't really talk about it concretely, you know, in a place like this. And it's strange. It's strange to look at a society that we live in and feel so apart from it. Like, it regards these things as, well, this is how you have fun, and doesn't think any further about it. I don't feel that I belong in that kind of society. And that's shaped a lot of the decisions that I've made over the years. So what I'm going to leave with before we go to the conversational part is that, you know, just like that waypoint summary of events, concrete facts about my life, didn't feel satisfying to me and didn't feel like my life. You know, I structured this presentation this way because that's how I feel about game design these days. You know, you see people talk about game design, probably especially in school. Like, I was never in a school that actually taught game design, but you know, when you see what everybody talks about, it's all about the rules of the game, or the structure of play, or, you know, protocols, or you know, magic circles, things like that, that are about how things are shaped, or about the concrete facts. And it ignores what's inside, right? It ignores like the essence of the game, or what actually, like, I don't care about the rules of games. I don't care about magic circle. Like that stuff is meaningless to me, right? So when I'm playing a game, what makes that my play session, as opposed to just an arbitrary entity interacting with an arbitrary set of rules, right? I'm very interested in that subjective experience now. Back when I started Braid, sort of the process of designing that game got me interested in this, because just the way that I was inspired there brought me more and more into the realm of the subjective. And that's the kind of question that I'm looking to pursue now. Like, what is consciousness, right? If I'm going to spend my life building these systems that are about interacting in a closed, tight loop with a conscious person, don't I want to understand really what is happening there, right? That's what's important to me now. And that's my future design direction. And I think that's it. So, yeah.
Thank you. Excellent. And these lights now work. So I'm going to pull this up, and we're going to cozy up at this little table.
Right.
And I'm going to grill you.
Awesome.
With lots of tough questions. How many people have played Braid? Raise your hand if you played Braid. Okay, good. So a lot of people have.
Not enough.
I'm interested in hearing a little bit more about the development process. So you basically made Braid as a one-man band. So you worked with a visual artist. You've worked very closely with a visual artist. You had the skeleton of the game, and then you worked with a visual artist to really flesh out the surface of that. But it was primarily you as a designer and programmer building out the whole game. And how long did that take?
You know, I think David Hellman, who's the main artist for the game, came on in about mid-2006, like August '06. So he was on for a little less than the last 2 years, like a year, 10 months, a year, 9 months.
And how far along was the game at that point? Like,
well, I mean, it was fully playable from end to end. So
really?
It had won the IGF in 2006 without an artist. So,
right.
And everything, like...
That's true.
Yeah, yeah. The whole game was there. All the levels were there. It just didn't look very good. And over the course of that next 2 years, you know, not only were we making it nicer to look at, but I was refining the gameplay, throwing out some puzzles that I didn't like and replacing them with things that were better, or deleting elements of making the puzzles simpler. There's a very minimalist aesthetic to the level design.
Yeah.
That took a long time to understand how minimal things could be. You can't just, because you make something and it's more complicated than it needs to be.
And am I right in thinking that that Braid is one of the, if you look at something like Metacritic, it's really one of the highest, not just the highest rated Xbox Live Arcade games, really one of the highest rated Xbox games in general?
Yeah.
Is that true?
Yeah, it peaked at number 8.
Okay.
And then like Fallout 3 came out, I think, and pushed it down. I think it's number 10. But
wow.
That was a couple months ago.
So I think that's one thing that's remarkable and worth kind of commenting on and celebrating, that really a work of a single person or a very small team. But mostly, I mean, as you said, the game was basically built by a single person, can occupy that status. And
it's a two-edged sword, right?
Yeah.
So on the one hand, yeah, like I totally like to suggest, yes, you can make a game and have it on Metacritic, like with everything else, if you care about quality, right? Like I didn't talk about the development of Braid, but it was all about caring about the quality of the game and very little about caring how much it would sell or how much fun people would have. Like quality of a game and fun are different things.
What? How explain that a little bit more. Unpack
well, like
that
I
for
said,
us,
I've never cared that much about abject fun. So
what does that mean?
Well, I don't know. Like when people say people play games to have fun and they don't think about it, that's what I mean, right? Like fun, as we know as game designers, whenever we try to define fun, we always fail because we don't actually know what it is. And so culturally, the way we deal with that is just by not thinking about it, and just by saying that things are fun or not fun.
I'm moving this because it's.
Are we echoing?
It feels a little hot. Are we a little hot?
Yeah. So
that's an audio term. Okay.
So. But what that leads to.
So wait a minute. So because I want you to talk about this a little more, because obviously it's standard operating procedure in talking about game design to focus precisely on those qualities of like the player experience, and most people would think of that as in terms of trying to maximize the fun. So
yeah, well, I was definitely focused on the player experience, but it wasn't about really fun. So Braid is a game. Again, I always say Braid is a game about blah, and it's a very complicated game.
Yes.
So when I say this, it's not just about this, right? But it's about exploring possibility spaces, right? Like you go into a place and it's got some certain rules to it that you don't understand yet, and you start to observe those rules and figure out how objects will interact as a result, as an emergent result of those sometimes. Or it's not quite complicated enough to call it emergent, but as a second order result, and you use that to solve puzzles, right? And in constructing those worlds, I was interested maybe a little bit more in truth than I was in fun. So in math, for example, hopefully some people in here have a good math background, right? What's called true in math is just you have some things that you accept as true to start with, and then anything that you can deduce without ever finding a conflict is then considered true, right? So in math, truth kind of reduces to consistency, which is maybe a little bit empty and unfulfilling as a human being, but at the same time, that allows you to do things and be pretty sure about them, and then you can map that back to the real world and let it inspire thoughts about the real world. So this is kind of a systems theory version of that, where you have a system and it has a couple of rules to it that are modifications from what you already played, and there are consequences to that. And the puzzles in Braid are actually illustrations of those consequences, right? They're not, where do I put the puzzle piece that's most fun, but I've mapped out what I consider to be the 12 most important and informative and illustrative consequences of this rule system, and I'm going to illustrate those now in the most minimalist way I can by putting puzzle pieces there and challenging you to get them. And not even challenging you, I'm just putting it there, and you figured out in the first level that you're supposed to get those. So you're kind of challenging yourself, right? And that's it. So it was about this communication of what's interesting about these systems, and for people who find that fun, cool. But a lot of people don't necessarily find it fun. You know.
Braid, let me ask you. Yeah, I mean, what do you think is the role of challenge in a game like Braid? So you described this notion of abject fun. What's an example? Is that related to challenge? Is that related to sort of hard challenge?
Fun, I don't want to use that phrase because that actually sounds kind of fun, like abject fun.
Yeah.
Let's talk about.
What's an example of the type of thing you're describing? Like an example of a kind of abject fun. Is it mastering a course in Grand?
No, not even that. Like I can't pin it to anything specific because as soon as you do that, like everybody has a different experience of driving games or whatever.
Mm-hmm.
But I'm just talking about the cultural idea of fun. I said the word culture, so sorry, Eric. I don't mean it that way either.
Now.
Yeah. No, like there's this idea like, hey, I'm going to go to a party because parties are fun. Like every party's different, and most of them actually aren't that fun.
No, it's true.
But we go like somehow for the hope of fun or something, right?
Yeah.
That's what I'm talking about. And that's the kind of thing that game designers actually labor under. There's this idea of fun that maybe doesn't actually exist that is used to design most games.
And what's another example other than a lame party? Like in a video game.
Not even the party could have been fun. I don't know.
Right, but in a video game, right? Is this a common thing that you're describing, or do people discover things that are genuinely fun despite the fact that they were designed under the false promise of this other weird form?
I mean, there are a lot of books about why people play games, right? And I tend to stay away from that territory because whenever I read those, like, here's the 8 kinds of fun or whatever. Like, it's useful if you want to sit down and think about games a little bit, but it's always, like I was saying in the little talk, it's always missing to me the real part. Like it's usually the 10% around the shell of the thing. Like if it's an egg, we've kind of got a lot of the shell of the egg, but the inside of the egg, the part that you actually eat, is like not there.
Yeah.
Right? So I don't like systems like that, and I don't like trying to categorize things. Sometime far in the future when we understand games better, maybe it's time for that.
Okay.
But and so I'm just not inclined to try and say why people play.
Do you play games for pleasure? Presumably, I mean, do you play games? You expose yourself to games.
I
the experimental gameplay workshop.
You
expose yourself to a lot of games, and there's a kind of high level pleasure of like honing your craft or understanding what other people are doing.
Yeah.
Do you come from a hard day programming games and play games just for relaxation and pleasure? Do you have games in your head that you're like, well, I can't wait to get home and play this, or I can't wait to find an extra hour and play this?
Yeah, sometimes. So Spelunky is a game that's like that.
Okay.
Right? So I just really wanted to play that game, and it was really fun. And, and I played it a bunch, and that was great,
Were there games that that meant a lot to you, or that you enjoyed, or that were super meaningful to you that inspired like Braid, or that helped to frame your process when you're making
It's
Braid?
hard to pinpoint really, because Braid was mostly inspired by books and movies, right? It was definitely, and that was one of the original ideas behind it. It was definitely taking the form of a book merged with a game, right? As opposed to, where most of the industry is going, which is like, oh, movies are how we tell story, right? Movies one medium, right? Just because you have the ability to have, full motion cutscenes and stuff doesn't mean that this other medium is now worthless, right? It's a different thing. And so I wanted to come in a different direction. There are lots of games that are kind of, those are all my slides. Cool.
Slides within slides.
Yeah.
How did that did you do that on purpose?
No.
It's kind of beautiful.
Yes.
Wow. Jonathan Blow, ladies and gentlemen.
Yeah. This is going to be in the MoMA next week. What were we saying?
I was
games.
about to ask you.
Okay, I feel like I was going to answer a
No.
question.
You were talking about how it was kind of inspired by a book, or,
yeah,
or
well,
by the structure of books.
So there are a lot
like
of
novels.
games that inspired Braid in the small, right?
Like,
well, some of the games that are name checked in there.
right, like Super Mario.
Well, not really even Super Mario. I mean, that was inspiring because of its simplicity.
Yeah.
But
you directly reference.
Oh yeah, yeah. No,
like
I do.
Donkey Kong, and yeah.
I do, but that was
Yeah.
more thematically, right? Because
Okay.
once I knew what Braid was about,
Yeah.
it was about this pursuit, and like Super Mario Brothers is at once the most game mechanically simple and most culturally recognized among video gamers. Canonical pursuit,
Right.
He's always chasing the princess, and
Yeah.
she's always in the next place.
Yeah.
And so that was kind of where I started, but I never had a Nintendo when I was a kid.
Okay.
Really the real influences behind Braid are some games. A lot of them are not really name checked. Some of them are like Elevator Action.
Okay.
There's a game called Dino Eggs, which is not explicitly name checked, but actually has a lot to do with Braid. Trinity, adventure game by Brian Moriarty, is kind of in there.
Braid is super dense referentially. I mean,
Yeah.
it is actually, like, if you look at the surface of the game, the visual, it's laced with all kinds of subtle pointers to other things, and that kind of resonate with each other. And
Which nobody ever talks about, the
Yeah.
visual part. Everybody always talks about the story.
and I was going to ask
Nobody
you about that.
talks
like,
about the visuals, and nobody talks about the gameplay.
So I wanna-
even though that's where the gameplay especially is where a lot of the important part is, right?
Yeah. Well, I mean,
So-
people talk about the gameplay, perhaps, but yeah, there isn't a lot of discussion about the. I mean, it's almost like it reminds me a little bit of like one of those T.S. Eliot poems that I never know what the hell he's talking about, because he references this famous mythical figure and then this famous historical event, and we don't learn those things anymore. It was like it was for an audience that you could assume knew all of those references and for whom they would resonate in really interesting ways.
Yeah.
But like, were you disappointed with? First of all, like, was that density of reference a kind of conscious design decision that relates to the rest of the game, relates to time manipulation, or relates to this idea of the endless pursuit or the kind of hopelessness of these things, or was it just more like an intuitive thing that just emerged out of the working process with the visual artist?
It's kind of both, right? Like so on the one hand, I was being very over the several year development process, I was being very what do you call it? When you're not premeditated.
Oh,
right?
like intuitive, like
Yeah. I mean, I knew what the game was about in the whole, but when it came to designing individual puzzles or little pieces of what would happen, it was very spontaneous,
Yeah.
off the cuff kind
Yeah.
of thing. But there was always a filter running in my head, right? Like, I know what this game is about, and I would have many ideas, probably most ideas that I would then reject because they didn't fit the game, right? But they were just kind of ideas that I had, right? Because this is another thing about my personality, which is that through experience, I find that my subconscious mind is a lot smarter than my minute-to-minute rational mind.
Mm-hmm.
So when I just come up with ideas and I don't know where they came from, I trust those a lot more than like, let me devise a plan that will inspire the player or make them feel whatever, right?
Yeah.
I think that's where the best work comes from. The best work happens when you're in the shower or when you go to sleep and you wake up the next day and you just know something.
Yeah.
Right?
It's funny, David Serlin, who just spoke at the Game Developers Conference and whose talk I missed, but I was reading his notes, and he quoted someone along the same lines as saying that contrary to what you might assume, intuition is extremely good for solving really big, important problems, whereas like conscious, deliberate thought is better for solving very kind of small problems.
Yeah, there was some study that just said that.
Yeah,
Like once
yeah.
the number of variables rises above something.
So this density of thematic reference, all these like pointers, which kind of contributes to the literary quality of what it's like to play Braid, is to me it's like it's weird. I don't know exactly understand how it's related to what the game is about, as you say, but it does feel very much like it is. And there was a process in the reception of the game as people were playing it and discussing it online. There was a lot of discussion about the idea of meaning, about how to, so first of all, I think it's well understood that this is an interesting topic to you, that it's important to you. You speak about this issue, that games can be meaningful in ways that they aren't typically nowadays. And then obviously, as you play through the game, there's a literary quality to it. There is a sense that these pointers are trying to weave, some kind of larger thing, but it never really resolves. People tried to resolve it, and the interesting thing to me was that this game, which is kind of a sequence of challenges. Each one of these puzzles illustrates kind of a different truth, as you say, about the underlying system, and then the overall process of trying to understand the game was itself approached like a puzzle by a lot of people. And was that a conscious thing where you thought, kind of untangling all of these references is kind of a challenge in the same way that getting that piece is a challenge? Was that on purpose, or am I just imagining?
This is the kind of area that I don't like to speak too concretely about, because
next
everybody
question.
on the internet.
Yeah, I know. Did it bug you? Because I know that that was a strong element.
Every time I say something in that area, everybody uses it to prove their theory that ignores most of the game and focuses on one thing.
Right.
I'll just have to say yes and also no simultaneously to your question, because everything that you said is true, and yet my goal wasn't what. There's got to be some famous movie that presents it, maybe like Memento, but Memento is even supposed to be kind of ambiguous, maybe.
Yeah.
But if you watch some movie where things are presented in kind of a confusing way, and then you're supposed to resolve it, and then I know that this sequence of events happened.
Like The Usual Suspects,
the guy,
maybe the classic.
Yeah,
example.
the guy was in the parlor with the lead pipe or whatever.
Right,
and that's, you're supposed to figure that out. It's not like that.
Right. And yet a lot of people kind of approached it as if it
well,
were.
that's the example that most people have to work from, right? So, that's cool.
One of the things that I wanted to ask you about was the relationship between programming and game design. So you're a programmer. When you describe the structure of the gameplay, the way that you approach thinking about the design of the game, it's deeply informed, it seems, by this understanding. And I'm just wondering, how important is, do you see those two things as separate? Do you see those two things as kind of deeply unified? And do you need to be a programmer to be a good game designer?
Well, obviously you can design a game without programming. For example, Drop 7 is a fabulous game.
Thank you.
You didn't program it, right?
It's that $50 I owe you.
Yeah. But this particular game would not have been nearly, if I'm allowed to assume that it's good, because I like it, not talking about that you should think it's good, but the level of quality that I think the game plays at, for example, just the minute-to-minute game design, would not have been achievable if it were me and a separate game designer. Because a lot of it just happened because I didn't have to communicate with myself. I just knew, and I just saw, and I could just do things, right? So the first idea behind the game, even before I programmed Rewind, I knew it was going to be, one of the books that it's modeled after is Calvino's Invisible Cities, right? Where you go from place to place, and there's kind of a different idea at work behind every place, and there's kind of a small session there, and then you move on. And a physicist at MIT named Alan Lightman wrote a book called Einstein's Dreams, which is obviously Invisible Cities kind of morphed onto the story of Albert Einstein and how he came up with the theory of relativity by imagining all these different ways that time can behave and what that would mean for human interaction, which was a little bit unsatisfying to me as a work of literature because it didn't feel true. It felt more like thought jamming, But in taking that kind of idea and making it into systems, right? Like I said, systems embody truth until you screw them up by adding if statements in special cases, right? Which I did some of. They're biased toward truth, right? So getting back to the question, once I decided it was going to be about all these different places where time behaves differently, the first idea I implemented, it wasn't the first idea I had even, but the one that was clearest to program was the rewind. I know how to do that, so I did it in a couple days or something. And then once I did that, the way that I implemented it, I saw that certain things were possible. Like, okay, well, I'm doing the rewind by recording every frame, the state of all the objects in the world. Well, what if some objects don't make it into that list? What happens, right? That's a what if question that was obvious looking at the code, but that a designer wouldn't an abstract designer wouldn't necessarily have. Like if you're paper prototyping Braid, like where does that come from? Maybe you would still have that idea, but it's less probable maybe, right?
Yeah.
And then from there, oh, okay, so some things can be immune to rewind, and then what happens, right? What are the consequences, right? Oh, well, so I'm controlling this time thing with a rewind button, but it doesn't have to be controlled that way, right? Like I was thinking about Lorentz contraction and how you can kind of view that as, if time is a fourth dimension, as various theories of relativity have it, Lorentz contraction is kind of like you're rotating your frame of reference so that time kind of rotates in and other things rotate out, and that's why distances get screwy. At least that's my lay understanding of it. I'm not a physicist. But well, what if time and space are conflated? Well, Lorentz contractions are complicated and unplayable kind of. What can I do in a platformer? Well, time and space could be the same thing. Mm-hmm. So I made the x direction is as you move along it, time advances, and then you go back and time goes backwards. But I knew that that was implementable. It's the reason I did it. I wouldn't have had that design idea if I didn't see, oh, I just need a t variable to put in this function and stuff. So at some level, programming is just the roots of game design reaching down to the soil where it gets nourished, right? Like
that's a beautiful image,
And sometimes the roots are kind of going through excrement and stuff, but that helps everything grow.
No, I'm super fascinated by this topic. I mean, you mentioned Drop 7. Like, I didn't design that. That was designed by a group of people, like myself and Kevin Cantian, who is a programmer. No, but I mean, the point is that that's a great example. Like, that game wouldn't exist unless part of that design came out of the mind of a programmer. Every game I've ever worked on where I wasn't the programmer was in some form of deep collaboration with a programmer. And even when I'm thinking about game design, a lot of the time what I'm trying to do is think like a programmer, right? Yeah. And a little bit of programming, and a lot of the time the real work of game design comes from trying to form thoughts that make sense within the context of a computer program.
Yeah, I actually I started talking about this idea back maybe at the GDC 4 or 5 years ago. This is probably a dated analogy now, but I thought of it as like programming is the last mile of game design. This idea that like if you're laying high-speed internet stuff, you have your internet backbones, which are very fast, but you have to get that bandwidth out to everybody's house, right? And you can go into regional places, but the last mile is like from your regional hub that goes to everybody's house. It's like all these picky details that need to happen well for everybody to have like high-speed connections, right? And if you're designing a game, if you're a high-level designer and you don't think down at the nitty-gritty level, you're just designing kind of the backbone part, and you can design the shape of that, but everybody's experience is being informed by all these decisions that designer isn't necessarily making. Well, somebody has to make them because they happen, right? What happens is the programmer who gets this design doc at a bigger company, right, says like, oh, well, the guy is supposed to run and then slow down and stop, right, if it's a platformer. Well, what is the function that controls the rate at which he stops and all that? The programmer makes that decision, and it's actually a design decision. Yeah. But it's also an implementation decision. And so a lot of the game design, especially as the game gets bigger, de facto happens by programmers and not by designers. And that's one reason why actually a lot of large, expensive games don't feel that good when you play them, because the people making those decisions aren't viewing them as serious design decisions, right? It's sort of a dysfunctional thing that happens at large companies.
Yeah. And it's super important question for, so we're putting together the Game Center, and then that's going to grow and eventually, become a department in game development, and thinking about how programming fits into that. I mean, I've been teaching game design for many years. I'm not a programmer, and I teach game design outside the context of implementing digital games, the nuts and bolts of implementing digital games. And yet I still think that games have this deep relationship to not necessarily programming, but to computation and to understanding the world in terms of overlapping processes. And one of the things that you've talked about before is dynamical meaning. Is that the right phrase?
I mean, I kind of made it up, so it doesn't matter. So.
So in contrast to maybe a more traditional story structure, where you create a game by thinking, okay, the character's going to do this, and then the character's going to do this other thing, and the character's going to do this other thing. Dynamical meaning is the idea that the sort of moment-to-moment interaction of the player with the system itself conveys meaning. I mean, is that a good interpretation
Sure,
of that?
and it's, I don't want to present it as some wacky idea that I came up with, because in reality it's an obvious thing. Like, anytime you add information into a medium somehow, right, there are things that the audience will glean from that information. So like animators, right? If you had stories just in books, right, and then, I don't know, like Disney animators or whatever, we're skipping forward in time a little bit, but imagine that was the next medium after books, where you kind of had words on a screen and like guys animating. There's this huge body of knowledge in animation about how you communicate things about characters through the way they move or the way they're drawn. And it took them a while to figure those things out, right? But it's obvious that if you then go and draw a character counter to the way that you want the audience to perceive them, it's not going to work very well, right? So a similar thing happens with game design. The problem is game design is lower frequency, it doesn't change as fast, and it's subtler, and we don't see it very well yet. But the things that you encourage the player to do and the things that the in-game entities do carries a lot of meaning, right? And if that conflicts with the larger structure of your animations even, or of your story in the text, or of the music, anything, if any of that's disharmonious, it weakens the whole thing, right? Unless you're intentionally creating disharmony.
Yeah. I have a bunch of other questions, but I think actually what I want to do is open it up to everyone and get some questions from you guys. So I'm going to up the lights to signify this this change, and ask people to raise their hands if you have a question. Yes.
Kick it off. What is the design doc for it look like? Braid.
Was there a design doc for Braid?
I don't even, like, I haven't seen a design doc in like 15 years. I'm trying to remember what they look like. No, I mean, even, larger companies, the main purpose of a design document is to communicate from the designers usually, to people implementing things, what needs to happen, right? And there's a lot of information, and you don't really write a paper document anymore of any kind of structure. Usually now people just have a wiki or whatever where you just go and like, here's the characters and here's what Grunto is supposed to look like or whatever, right? And here's the concept art. So they're kind of these living things that change and are still always wrong, even though they're always changing. But the original concept of design document was just so quickly wrong and so quickly out of date and so quickly ceased to keep pace with reality that, like, all the people, like, schools have been teaching design document. I don't know if you guys do it, but it was always kind of wrong the whole time. So,
Yeah.
Yeah.
I'm just thinking of the design document that I'm working on right now.
but even, okay,
bullets getting
so-
this design document.
Close, we don't have to do it.
Yeah.
Yeah, exactly.
But
Are there
even-
producers? Is our producer in the?
No, but there is something that takes the place of that document, right? But it tends to be structured on a company-by-company basis by what they find most valuable or whatever, right? Or what they care the most about. And that's it. It's just a way of talking to your team. For me, for a long time, I was the only team. So I just did everything. And then David came on, and I would have some back and forth emails with him. And I would say, can you draw this? And he would send me a sketch, and I'd be like, no, make it have polka dots. No, I wouldn't say that, but
Are you
brighter
interested-
or whatever, and we would figure it out, and then we wouldn't need any more than that.
Are you ever interested in working on a project with a larger team in which more formal structures would be? You don't ever would not.
Maybe at
Yeah.
most a small team, but I just don't. The things that I find interesting in game design, like the subjectivity kind of things that I talked about in these fabulous slides, I can be explored effectively without $40 million or whatever, right? I don't need that. And what I lose when I go to that structure, I lose control over what I'm actually doing. So I may become incapable of exploring the subjects that I want to. Because like I said, like all those, like little things in Braid all the time, like there would be one puzzle and it's like, the rules of time result in good behavior. Like if Braid was an actual reality with like time stepping forward at the Planck level and like very small particles, then it would be a lot more consistent than it is. But in reality, because it's a video game, like things kind of break when you push them. And I'd make a puzzle and it kind of pushes things too hard and the interaction feels really bad. And so those if statements I was talking about were like, well, even though this happens as a system to make it more playable, I really have to go in and do something special only for this one puzzle. And that happened like 30 times. And there's only 60 puzzles in Braid. So multiply that by like the size of a big game and it quickly becomes clear that you can't give that amount of personal attention to everything in a large game. And then without that, you don't kind of have that last mile, right? So if you're doing something coarse, if you have a coarse level game design idea, like I think it's awesome to fly and then land and run really fast and then tunnel into the ground to the core of the earth. Like, I don't know. Like, if that's your design vision, you can do that and get that across, and even if the controls kind of suck. But if you try to do something subtle and emotional, or even like small intellectual ideas, you can't do that unless you have a very high precision instrument, right?
Yeah.
And you lose that precision on a big team, unless you have like insane amounts of money.
Do you think this is related to, so you've said some interesting things about the ethics of games. We can last all winter.
So let's get back to the idea of what's fun and why people play things, which I said I wouldn't talk about, right? If you're a modern scientifically minded person, which I am not necessarily 100%, but if you are, you believe in this evolution thing and that we evolved to where we are today and we have these tendencies that we got because they have survival value. And there's a large random element, there's a large individual element, but in general, the things that people do, they do for the most part because more often than not, it was the right thing to do in order to stay alive or to be more effective or whatever. And often that breaks, like you end up in a situation where your low-level instincts don't perform correctly and you end up jumping the wrong way, or or something looks pretty and you eat it and it was poisonous, right? So evolution is not perfect, but so the things that we find fun in the past, like things like physical play, like sports, well, it keeps you in shape and it gets you used to moving in close proximity to other people, right? After you've been doing that for a while, as I know from martial arts training, you just get a lot more comfortable there and you become a better judge of distance and you can react better, right? You get a lot more time, as we were talking about before the show. You can go into all these examples of like what was considered fun, intellectual things like, oh, chess or Go or something, right? It gets me to engage my higher level thought processes, right? I'm approaching a really hard problem, right? And I'm not saying it's perfect, but some idea of what was generally regarded as fun always had survival value, maybe not even to the individual, again, because Dawkins' self-achieved thing is all about how it's actually often a collective thing that screws the individual, but it had some kind of merit, right? There's some kind of reason why doing a fun thing was probably good sometimes, okay? So now you move into the modern age where we're not really in the environment we evolved in anymore. There's all these artificial things, and they're not just artificial, but they're created by somebody with an explicit intention behind them, right? Often, the intention is to make money, right? Often it's something else. Sometimes it's just, I don't know, sometimes it's just to be entertaining and have fun, right? But now that these large parts of our environment are being created by agents that have a purpose behind creating those things, we need to be more careful in assessing whether the effects they have on us are really beneficial anymore or not, right? And this is where I start thinking, well, there's certain kinds of fun that are natural or, and certain kinds of fun that are artificial, right? Because there's a certain way, if you start engineering fun, if you start doing a lot of focus groups and things, you can find out the things that people really enjoy and you can kind of start hacking it, right? Kind of like if you put up a phishing site that looks like a regular site and takes people's passwords, right? If you refine and iterate on what makes a game compelling, you can eventually find ways to really push people's buttons, right? And when you do that, so now I'm going to sit down as a game designer. I know all these ways that I can engage people in a game and push their buttons and make them want to play my game, right? Then the question is, how do I use it? Well, I could use it in such a way that keeps in mind this idea that very few people believe or think about, that fun has a reason behind it and should be beneficial, right? Well, nobody thinks about that, part A, but part B is that that's hard. It's harder to make a game that's not, it's harder to make a game that's actively beneficial or that at least is not destructive of the player than it is to make any game, right? Because the former is a subset of all games, right? So now if you're a company, right, and you want to make money, that's your intention, that's why you're putting this thing out, you are going to minimize your risk, right? Especially if you've got 300 employees to feed, right? And the way that you minimize your risk is by doing the easiest thing possible while pushing those buttons. And the easiest thing possible is to not think about the effect on the mental environment, or to even acknowledge that there is a mental environment, right? Yeah. So as a small game designer, you kind of have the freedom. You could just be in it to make money, and a lot of people are. So there's not an inherent difference in virtue between small and large, but small, at least you have a choice. If you're large, especially if you're publicly held, even if you're not, you probably have a board of directors who fucking wants you to make money, right? Then that's going to drive the kind of games that you design, right? Yep. And that was probably too long of an explanation.
No, it was perfectly said. Okay. Yes?
Well, but based on this, can you think of any games by major studios that you think do drive a higher purpose of fun?
Well, all the time, things happen at a small scale, right? So you can treat a corporation as this inhuman thing, which it is, right? But individuals are working on the thing, and all the time people bring a little bit of art to their piece of the game, right? Often that doesn't make it into the feeling as a whole, but sometimes there are people at a higher level who kind of engage in things with a different intention. So for example, Clint Hawking, I don't remember his title, he's one of the main designers on Far Cry 2, perhaps.
Yeah, I think he's maybe creative director.
I don't know, something like that.
Ubisoft and yeah.
He designed Far Cry 2, which is a shooter where you go around in Africa being a bastard, shooting guys in the head, and basically everybody in the game is your enemy.
So there you go.
Yeah, but he had really interesting ideas, right? He wanted to make how do you say NPCs in a non-geeky way? Is that a standard term?
Yeah, NPCs.
I grew up saying NPC because so how to have NPCs that you actually care about, right? How they can interact meaningfully with the player. And it's in this scope of a shooter, right? Because that's what sells and what you can put a big team on. But it was trying to do meaningful things within that scope.
Yeah,
right?
I mean, that's a great example. He's struggling with these same issues. He understands that this stuff has ramifications and carries a lot of emotional impact and means something beyond just the activity of playing the game, and he's struggling with it. So whether or not he was successful in Far Cry 2, you can see that it bears the traces of someone really trying to wrestle with these ideas. So that's a good example. I don't know, for some reason I would say Mirror's Edge too, to me, bears that traces. I don't know why, but it's just something about their attempt to do something different and original in that space, maybe partly because of it forced them by being true to the core idea. So Mirror's Edge is a first-person runner-arounder, right? So it uses the kind of engine of a first-person shooter, but it's a game about exploring and running around dynamically through an environment much more than it is about shooting. It's almost not about shooting. You're being shot at, but you almost never shoot, and you can play the game without ever shooting. But just by being true to well, how do we actually do that? I think they created something that does a little bit speak to these ideas of challenge and violence and conflict within game models.
But I want to go back to the particular wording of that because, I kind of, the more I think about the question, right, it was phrased as people who have a higher level of, what did you say, like higher intention behind it or something.
Yeah, I don't think there are none.
Right. But I want to get to that part of the question because that's actually what I really have the issue with, which is that we're in this environment where actually thinking about the effect of your thing on the player at all is now considered a higher intention. It's no, that's like a baseline so going back to the idea of the physical environment, right? Back at the dawn of industrialism, we would just have factories and start just cranking stuff into the rivers and the sky, and people started getting really sick, and it's oh, maybe we shouldn't do that, right? And so now, back then it might be oh, are you going to start a factory with a higher intention of not poisoning the Thames or whatever, right? But now it's we've realized that that's a really bad thing, and it's well, the baseline now is that you don't fuck up the environment. And now you're kind of being really heinous if you build a factory that pollutes a river. Or if you have a higher intention, it's more like build a factory that actively cleans the ozone or cleans the atmosphere or creates electric cars or something, right? But the normal thing now is actually in the middle. Whereas now for games, the normal thing is at the bottom. For now, and it's like what people think of as a higher intention is actually the middle that we need to get to, or else we've completely fucked up the mental environment. And maybe the mental environment is not as critical as the physical environment, because we're not talking about dying if you mess it up, right? But we're talking about being kind of stupid, right? Or being infantilized as adults, kind of growing up as babies.
I die a little inside every time they release another Lego game.
Legos, a toy which is really,
yeah,
before they messed it up by all the pre-made spaceships, a very creativity-inducing and nice toy is now like the worst games.
I don't know why I
think ever
picked that
made,
one
like-
to criticize, but for some reason
Yeah.
I despair.
Yeah.
Other hands up? Yes.
Well, I was just wondering.
And okay, hold on. I know somebody's going to live blog. Jonathan Blow says Lego games are the worst games ever made. Don't do that. That's the kind of shit that always happens, and yeah. No, I don't think they're the worst games ever made, but they're personally disappointing.
No,
to
I
me.
mean,
Okay.
Wow. Now I feel bad too.
So I guess my question is about when you're designing, who are you thinking about as the player?
Someone kind of like me,
Okay.
which doesn't really exist, but there are a lot of people a little bit like me, right? And that's who you end up speaking to.
So
But
do you play test?
yeah, well, I play test by myself first, right? And then, like in Braid development, at certain stages, I would give it to a bunch of my friends, but they were game designer friends, right? And the reason is you can't expect, especially if you don't have graphics that look any good, you can't expect people to be able to play your game. They just won't, which is stupid, but that's the reality. Like people, like general public. So I gave it to game designers who could kind of understand the design rhetoric inside the game, like what the levels are saying and whether it's working, and they loved it, and that really inspired me to keep going. But as for actual general user play tests, Microsoft did one about a year ago, so Braid was very close to completion. Resoundingly negative results, like everybody hated the game. Microsoft kind of didn't want to publish it at that point anymore, and yet it was one of their most profitable games of the year, so what does that say about playtests?
So let me get this straight. So
One of the most profitable XBLA.
no design documents and no play testing. This is how you make a
Yeah.
great game.
Yeah, because the reason, and there's a deeper reason behind the no
Yeah.
playtesting, right?
Yeah.
Is that the game is not made to entertain people, right? It's not made to have fun. It's made to contain ideas in as interesting and distilled and respecting of the player's time a way as possible. And so I don't care if somebody doesn't really get a particular idea or doesn't see it. I mean, I do care. It'd be nice if everybody got it, but you don't take it out because people didn't get it, right? You give them room to find that idea 10 years from now or 20 years from now when they come back and play the game again, right? Like, I'm not making the game for 2008. Like, I'm making the game for the next long time.
Nice.
Yeah,
Well
right?
put. Yeah. Yep.
So,
There's very little of that thinking, and I support it. I think
yeah.
it's great. Yeah.
And so there's information you can get from playtests, but it's very limited. It's like, do people keep falling off the ledges a lot when they meant to jump, right? Because my platformer physics isn't very good. But you can nail that down pretty early. And then once you've done that, if your game has more to it than just jumping from platform to platform, which a lot of games do not, but if it has more ideas in it, then those are kind of have to be in your own personal space, and you can't test those.
So I just one follow-up point. So you get this negative feedback from Microsoft.
Well, they wouldn't even give me the real feedback, though, which is a whole other story. But yeah,
Oh, okay.
so
It seems like there would be enormous pressure to change the game or try to do something to address it.
well, they didn't fund the game, right? I paid for it, so I could kind of do whatever I want. The worst they can do is like, well, we're not going to release it on Live Arcade, and I'd be like, fine, and release it on the PC or whatever, right? Would have cost me a lot of money, right? But I didn't care. Like when I was making this game, I wanted to make the game as good as it could be. If I was completely broke and had to get a job at the end of that, that was fine, because I felt like I was making a really good thing. They did have a little, they tried to get me to put, a hint system in the game. And I thought about it, and I was like, nope, don't really want to do that. And so they ultimately didn't have that much influence over it. I did, as a result of those playtests, I did end up making the first level that you actually play a little bit easier.
Yeah.
It used to have kind of a bitch.
And there's
jumping
one,
puzzle
would
in
you
it.
agree that there's one mistake in Braid, is that one thing that you put in there intentionally to clue people in that you didn't always need to get?
Well, okay, yeah.
And then, but it's very consistent that people misinterpret that.
You mean the
think that they
thing
need
in the second level
Yeah,
or
because it
whatever.
implies that, oh, I'm going to get powers that enable me to get things later.
well-
so that's the lesson I've learned, and it's kind of the wrong lesson.
It's kind of a mistake that I don't know how to not make. Like, I thought about that, and I had the option of revising this for the PC version. I just don't know how to do it better.
No, leave it in. It's a wobby,
Yeah, no,
right? It's
I
a wobby.
absolutely am
Yeah.
leaving it in.
Good.
But it's not really a mistake, though. It's because, like, even now, seeing how people reacted to it, I have options of how I could have restructured. Nobody knows what puzzle this is,
Yeah.
really. But, like, it's a hard thing,
Yeah.
you know? And it's okay if players get the wrong idea, though, because the game is about being passive and, like, letting you as an active participant understand what's happening, right? And if you lead yourself down the wrong direction a little bit, that's okay, because all the information to come back from it is there, right?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Understood. Yes.
This has been a great talk, you guys. So thanks for all the stuff. I think what's interesting hearing you talk about games, John, is that on the one hand, games are such an analytic medium. They're highly structural objects as compared to a lot of other forms of media. I mean, they can communicate to us through, dialogue and characters and audio and sound and visuals. But the way that they speak or create meaning that's unique to games, in large part, derives from the fact that they're the highly systemic medium. And I think that one of the challenges is, as you put it, I think what's interesting about the way you talk about games is, on the one hand, you really acknowledge that. And some of your inspiration comes from mathematics. When you talk about being inspired by a game like Spelunky, it's because you're exploring a kind of mathematical possibility space. When you talk about how,
yeah,
well,
go
in
ahead.
part, or maybe an experiential or space of kind of recombinable experiences. When you talk about where the truth of Braid comes from, it's sort of this idea of consistency and encapsulating ideas within the sort of theme and variations of some of the initial premises of the game. Those are beautiful ideas, and I think what's challenging for all of us game designers is that one wants to get beyond that. One wants to get beyond an analytical understanding to something that you say you can't really name or you can't talk about, and you could put a lot of names to it. Sometimes I think about this as sort of soulfulness. Like how does a game, which is such a highly structured mathematical object, become soulful in a way that like Louis Armstrong is soulful? And I think that what's great to see kind of in terms of you say a lot of people wrote about rules and moodology and magic circle, and you're right that there was a lot of kind of analytic approaches to game design, and it's almost as if I think for us it's sort of coming up short. And now this year at the GDC, there's a lot of people trying to talk about meaning and trying to get deeper, more under the hood. And I think what's interesting is that the space where we find ourselves is really theorizing about pleasure in a certain sense, which, Freud, one of the earliest theorists of pleasure, it's kind of unknowable. Like the unconscious is by definition unknowable and therefore kind of unthinkable and the antithesis of rational thought. And we're like trying to bring these things together, which is a sort of notions about pleasure. And, is pleasure a higher pleasure in the sense of like the sort of, I don't know, like a Vulcan sense of pleasure or something? Or is it also stuff that's sort of perverse and self-destructive and masochistic and all these other sort of multiple shifting things of pleasure? So I don't know where it leaves us, but I just want to say I found the talk really provocative, and I think it's sort of a beautiful tension, trying to figure out both how to theorize about pleasure and how to get this highly kind of analytic structured medium to move into this realm of soulfulness.
Yeah, well, at some level, I mean, there's no way I can answer that whole question. I mean, I agree that all those trends are true. Yeah. Let me repeat the question so it's on tape. But I do find, so there is an obviously very analytical, technical part, especially with one guy doing everything, which is the programming part, right? Like, your program has to run, but I've been programming so much that I can just kind of do it almost as a reflex, and it doesn't connect. Like, I know what I want to make happen, and then I start typing, and I don't really have to think through. I don't have to consciously analyze very much, if anything. Part of that side rant is that my programming techniques are very, very simple, much simpler than they will teach you in school. End rant. Sometimes I've been sitting down to program, and it'll be like 15 minutes later, and I'll realize that I can't remember what I did for the past 15 minutes. And it's because I was doing this stuff, and now I hit compile, and it works.
Yeah.
So there is opportunity, even within us as humans, for a disconnection between the design part and the super analytical part. And what I'm trying to do now is disconnect that and not try to reintroduce it at the high level through these kinds of game design techniques. Like what rule will cause the player to feel stronger or whatever.
That's
I just try
super
not to do
interesting.
that.
Yeah, that's a really interesting way of putting it. I love this line of thinking, and I think that the more and more recently, I really think that many games are about this in some way. This relationship of kind of step-by-step rational problem solving, choice and consequence, and those kinds of analytical things, and intuition, right? And these things that are unnameable, and not to impose my interpretation of Braid onto it, but one of the things I like about it is I think the overall idea of Braid kind of captures that or expresses that, right? The little character and his struggles and his kind of pointless search, or endless search is a little bit like about that in my head. So it resonates with that.
I think an interesting phenomenon for me playing games for a long period of time is how your brain is sort of temporarily re-engineered to sort of still fit within the constraints and rules of that game. So like, for instance, playing Portal for a long amount of time, walking back to my apartment, I just had this impulsive thought about how I could get there faster by using portals, and then I had to stop and think, well, I don't have a portal gun. Did you ever, while you were developing Braid, think, oh, I stepped in that puddle, maybe I can rewind time, and then just sort of catch yourself in this lucid moment?
Yeah, especially at the beginning. I mean, it more came out as frustration, like being unable to play anybody else's platformer anymore, because not just that I wanted to hit rewind, but like it's so stupid that you're making me play this level again. Like why, which is one of the conscious design choices that I made in designing the game. But once I was actually able to play it, it was like I couldn't play other games anymore. But like playing like Half-Life and Counter-Strike and stuff, it's interesting how much more you notice ducks when you walk into a room. But there's a related area that came out in Braid that I think was really interesting, which is that a lot of people know about like video game dreams that you can have, which I haven't really seen talked about much. Somebody referred me to a paper that I haven't read, but like Tetris is a canonical example. Like you play Tetris a lot and you're falling asleep and you can kind of see the blocks in front of your eyes. Or Dance Dance Revolution is an even better one because it's pretty well known among people who know. Like DDR is a game that you play a lot to a very high skill level. And as you ramp up your skill at that game, the visions that you have when you're going to sleep start incoherent and become more and more coherent. Like at first you start seeing arrows in random places and maybe at random sizes. And then it's like, then they're all moving up, but maybe at different speeds. Then they're all moving up at the same speed. Then the right arrow is in the right column. And then eventually you're seeing the same kind of patterns that happen in the game between the arrows, right? So there's some kind of thing where your brain, visual system, in combination are training themselves to recognize and be fluent in certain kinds of stimuli, right? Which again, goes to the ethical thing. Like
Right.
if we're reprogramming people's brains to the point where you can see it happen, right? Don't we want to think about that? But that was always something that I found really interesting and didn't know how to address in game design without trying to make some weird, brainwash you kind of game. But it ended up being in Braid simply because of other decisions. I don't have a screenshot of the final gameplay, but those of you who have played the game know that it's the art direction is very different from most games. Like the background is very separated from the foreground, both in color palette and in the kinds of details. Like only the foreground things that the player can touch are allowed to have like high frequency by the pixel kind of details. The background is washed out. And there are a lot of reasons for that, but one of the main reasons going in was that I knew this is going to be a hard puzzle game sometimes easy, but sometimes hard, where you kind of end up looking at the screen trying to figure out how to get up there. And if you have to go experiment a lot to figure out if you can move through this thing or if it's background or whatever, that's noise. And I want to get rid of the noise and just display the puzzle to the player as clearly and with as few elements as possible, right? And like I said, I think before the thing, or I don't have a very good track of time after designing this game, right? Whether this happened before the talk or after, but the puzzles are all very minimalist, right? So I think that helps your brain get wrapped around what's going on. And so a lot of people report that they'll get stuck on something, they'll go away, have lunch, they'll come back, and they just know the answer to some puzzle that was impossible. Like they just didn't know how to do it. Or they'll go to sleep, and they'll wake up the next day, and they'll plow through like the next 2 worlds in a game that they were finding was very hard. And it's that engagement, right, of the parts of the mind that we don't see very well. And I think it worked well for this game simply because of that clear presentation, right, which is something that platformers don't usually try to do.
Yeah.
And I wonder, I wonder what that means for game design in the future, or for edgy games or whatever.
Right. More questions? I'd love to
Got a
get
lot of
someone
questions.
in the back. So we're going to take a couple more questions. Suzanne.
I'm wondering what you think about this notion, you were just starting to talk a little bit about that, of documentary games. And is there some inherent tension between playing with gameplay and the real world, what that intersection means?
Well, do you mean documentary game as in
A game that tries to deal with a real world issue.
issue, but not necessarily historical things that happened, right? But like,
More current.
yeah. Well, those games have been around for a long time. The earliest one I maybe know of is Chris Crawford's Scram, which was about how to run a nuclear reactor, like in the 80s. Maybe there were some before that. They're good. They're a good idea, right? That has not found effective execution yet, and one has to wonder why that is, right? Usually, my philosophy is it's a combination of all the things that you would think of, right? So it's probably because maybe the best designers aren't working on those games consistently enough. Maybe they're not well funded. Maybe there's not that much research and interest in them. But also maybe because it's inherently not that great of an idea. I don't know why exactly, but it's something about making a game interesting and compelling is really hard. It takes all of your attention. Like I was saying, the reason a game like World of Warcraft is so effective is they didn't have to balance the effectiveness of the game with other concerns. Right? Or the reason it can, like lots of people have made MMOs that weren't as compelling, right? So obviously it's hard even to get World of Warcraft. Try making World of Warcraft, but about how do you run a nuclear reactor? Like, good luck making that game, right? So it's hard. Maybe it's hard because it's a bigger task, but maybe it's also hard because by making your primary intention something to do with nuclear reactors, it takes away from the structure of the game that's allowed to go toward the player experience, and maybe there's just not enough to go around. And that, I would like to see that question addressed by somebody in the serious game space, but they don't really think about that very much. I mean, at least they don't talk about it publicly at conferences.
Some do.
Okay. Yeah. I mean, I'm not a
But
serious
it's a hard.
games
It's
person.
it's a good point.
But my next game actually is a little bit in that direction, but with a looser grip. It's
Nuclear
like,
power plant tycoon. Is that
yeah,
the
not,
game you were
not,
doing?
not nuclear power plants, but it takes an idea that you could view as a serious game idea, but then takes away that I'm trying to heavy-handedly teach you things here. And it's now more like, let's play in this space of ideas that people find interesting, right? And that some people might learn from, but that's fine if they do. It's really about making a good game, right? So it's like if serious games is like this, it's like grabbing it and kind of having a loose grip.
Nice.
And
Good
so
analogy.
we'll see how that works. It could totally suck. Like it probably will, like sophomore slump, right?
Yeah. Oh man. A lot of people waiting for that.
Yeah.
One more question. You, sir.
I was wondering,
Yes.
with what you were saying about sort of higher fun interacting with kind of evolutionarily.
Well, I don't like saying higher fun, but yeah, I just have to disclaim that
Better
every
fun.
time. Not even better. It's a different thing.
Okay.
So
But yeah, with like chess or physical sports, kind
Sure.
of interacting with evolutionarily useful skills.
we'll call it natural fun.
Natural fun.
Yeah.
What your thoughts were on? It seems like a lot of music and rhythm games teach some very sort of evolutionarily, at least existing skills. Like rhythm and harmony. And in the case of Audible, even some very complicated rhythmic skills, but extend a very limited amount of interaction. I
Yeah.
was just wondering what your thoughts were on that disjunct, if it is a disjunct.
Well, is that necessarily a conflict? I mean, are you saying the limited amount of interaction? Are you saying that interaction is kind of the purpose of rhythmic things,
Well,
or
it seems to be something that feels very satisfying and feels very useful?
Yeah, I mean, if I can,
Giving
like,
you very little
so
autonomy?
for example, like for example, like rhythm action games are in some ways you're like an automaton. You're being trained to just hit the button at the right time, and yet somehow they don't feel like abject fun, or they don't feel like this. They have the same kind of negative, necessarily the kind of negative resonance that some of these other
Yeah, I mean,
grinding games might have.
I don't know. It's not a genre of games that I think about too much. I don't really play them that much because I feel like actually I have a philosophical dispute with Dance Dance Revolution, which is kind of the start of not playing rhythm games anymore. Which was that not only are they teaching that low level skill, but they're actually teaching high level skills that they don't realize, right? Which is like the interpretation of music. How do you in your head group different phrases with each other? And I got really pissed. I was playing DDR. I don't know. I got kind of good at it. I was like 5 or 6 foot, which is not really very good if you're a DDR player, but it's better than a lot of random people are, right? And I was just watching, and I was just like, they put this pattern of arrows like here and there, and it implied a certain thing about the structure of the song, and I was like, that's bullshit. No, the song is actually this other thing that has this different pattern, but I am being forced to follow this pattern that I think is not as musically refined, and I'm being told that I'm wrong if I don't do that, right? So that's kind of my beef with rhythm action games. And to the extent that they stay on a lower level like that, like just hit the thing at the right time, I'm not that interested in that game anymore. Like I don't, the guys at Harmonix are friends of mine, but I don't really play Rock Band because I kind of have played Rock Band and I know what I have to get from it. And if it's not going to be with a bunch of friends, like if it's just going to be standing there doing it, I don't know what I get from that. So.
Cool.
Yeah.
All right, so I think we're going to wrap up. Before we finish, I want to briefly announce the other people that are coming in this series. On April 16th, we have Warren Spector. On April 23rd, Mark LeBlanc. On April 30th, Eric Zimmerman and Katie Salen are going to be here. And on May 8th, Clint Hawking, whose name came up earlier. So we've got a lot of interesting people coming. I want to thank Jonathan Blow for coming. Thank you so much. A wonderful talk. And thanks to all of you guys for showing up. Thank you.